We have sound. So 3 things. Number 1, we have sound. Number 2, I'm working through a cold, so I'm going to try not to cough all over you today, but I'm doing my best. And number 3, we have a team that sits down to plan messages like this. And one of the challenges I had when we talked about the topics we wanted to cover in this series, The Struggle is Real, is the team said, hey, we've got to tackle singleness and dating and the whole thing that is. And I said to them, first words out of my mouth is, I am singularly unqualified to teach that message. I mean, I haven't dated in decades. I've been married for 28 years. I have no idea what it's like to date. So what we're going to do, I'm going to teach through some scripture, offer a few points, but we actually have put a panel together today of people who maybe have a little more recent experience than I do. So that's where we're going today. But we are talking about singleness and dating, and my experience is decades old. If you were here for part 1 of the series, you heard Tony and I, my wife Tony and I, give the first message that our marriage hasn't been easy, but it's been so worth it. But I was thinking back, what did I learn about dating? And I thought, I was pretty much a disaster. That's pretty much what I learned about dating. I remember my first date with Tony. So I was smitten. Some of you know that story. I told it again a couple weeks ago. I was absolutely smitten. And finally she said, yeah, we'll have a date. So the date was over at my place, my apartment. We were still students. And I decided to go all out rather than take her out for dinner. I cooked at home, and I cooked craft dinner. That was date number 1. And that's not craft with a C, okay? That would be different. If it was craft dinner, hand-sprouted, artisanal, coconut oil, essential oil, arugula, that's impressive, okay? No, this is craft dinner with a K, box, boil, cheese dust, eat, all right, craft dinner. So I did craft dinner with Tony, and, she still decided to go on a second date, which was great. So that's how my dating stories sort of end. So that's why we really need a panel in this on this week, which we do. But a couple of thoughts before we bring up the panel and invite them. Number 1, this is a series, so even though last week we didn't talk about being single, we talked about social media, I think everything we talked about last week applies to being single. So I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, if you weren't in the room, go back and watch part 2. Just go back and watch part 2. We talked about comparison. And I think if you look at a lot of the uncomfort and the upset that we have around being single again, wanting to get married, having the relationship of your dreams dissolve, so much of the unhappiness that stems from that comes out of the things that we're struggling with today in terms of social media, comparison, discontentment, anger at God. We talked all about that. So I think you could basically take everything we taught last week and put it on this week, and it would work. But we're going to go in a new direction. When I sat down with the panel and with some people who are single, and I said, okay, what can I learn as a guy who's been married for decades? What can I learn? What is the most important thing that we need to communicate today? And you know what rose to the surface, and it really resonated with me? It resonated with me because as I've met couple after couple, talked to person after person, relationship over relationship after decades as well in ministry, I have seen this played out again and again and again. And so the big idea today, for all of you who are single, maybe you're very happily single, we'll talk about that. But I know from a lot of the singles that I talk to, a lot of the singles I know in my life, if they were to be really honest, they're not happily single. And you're single not because you want to be, but because the right person hasn't come along, or you're single again because the marriage didn't work out, or because, you're widowed, or something like that. And you're like, I don't want to be here. And so the pressure to connect, the pressure to be in a relationship, the pressure to say, okay, I'm just going to find somebody, leads us into places we don't want to be and kind of loses the moment on us. The current season becomes unhappy because we're not in a season we want to be. We want to be somewhere else. It's like being in a job, but saying, I hate my job, I want a better job. I don't like my station in life, I don't like where I'm at. And what people told me as I was doing research for this message was simply this, and I thought it was really good advice worth sharing. Pick God, not the wrong person. Pick God, not the wrong person. Because the pressures of being single, the pressures of being in a place where you're not married and you think you should be married, you should be in a relationship, you should be dating, you should see somebody, will cause you to want to pick the wrong person. So I want to introduce that idea, but now I want to introduce you to that panel. So will you join me in welcoming 3 people that we know and love here at Connexus. Joining us today, Jen Hood, Danelle Sewell and Sarah Piercy. So give it up for them as they come and join us. Well, thank you so much for saying you'd be willing to come out here and talk about being single. So let's do some quick introductions down the line. Who's who?
Yeah, so I'm Jen. I'm 27 years old, and dating and singleness both have been a part of my journey for like the last 10 years, I would say.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm Danelle. I'm 25, and I agree. Like, I've been single. I might be dating. Yeah.
I am Sarah. I was single until I was 28. I'm now 32 and married with 2 kids.
Mm-hmm. It's the voice of experience. So I want to ask you a few questions and just jump in as you feel comfortable. But question number one, a lot of us watching this haven't dated in a while, whether that's been half a decade or many decades or whatever. What do you think has changed? And for those of us who are parenting kids who are dating or moving into that phase, what do you think has changed in dating over the years?
Yeah, I was talking about this question with a couple people, and one of the things that stood out to me was I think a lot of times it takes us a lot longer to make a decision, to make a commitment to somebody, and that's, I think, probably one of the big reasons is that there's so many options. So there's things like online dating, and there's dating apps, there's all of these things, and so because there's so many choices, it's like too many choices limits you to making no choice at all, because you feel the pressure of, well, what if I make the wrong choice, and what if I choose the wrong person? And so I think that slows down that dating process pretty significantly for a lot of people, because they're fearful of making the wrong decision.
I agree with you, but I think I will disagree. I think from my perspective, a guy perspective, there's so many options, so why not just date so many people? So why just wait for one person? You can just date this person, date that person. So there's so many options. I think it has changed because you're no longer in the circle of like your parents or your family's circle. You have so many options now to go online, different places. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would actually say the core of dating hasn't changed. The core of a healthy relationship hasn't changed. The core of healthy dating experiences is still the same, but the tools to get there are really different. So there's online dating, which I'm actually a big fan of, and I think there's healthy ways to do online dating.
I am not.
So, and we disagree, and that's okay. But I think the core of a healthy relationship is actually still the same, but the way we get there now is so different with Tinder, and you just keep swiping endless faces, and that has really changed. But the core of a relationship is still the same.
What do you think the most challenging aspect of dating has been or is, as you've seen your own life or your friend's life? What's the most challenging aspect of it?
Dating is so hard. It's so hard. And you put yourself out there again and again, and sometimes you get rejected, sometimes you're not sure how you feel about the other person, and you have to let them down. It's so hard. And in my experience, the hardest thing to do is actually establishing healthy physical boundaries in the relationship when you're dating. And I will be really transparent and tell you that I decided in my dating life that I wasn't going to sleep with the person that I was dating. And that included guys that I loved, that I thought I was going to marry. And that was one of the best, healthiest decisions that I made, but it is so hard. And I think it's the hardest part about dating, because in our culture, the expectation is that there are no boundaries. And we lose those boundaries, and then you lose a lot of the healthy aspects of getting to know somebody, because they get really confused in physical intimacy when the relational intimacy isn't there. So I think that's the hardest part of dating, is actually those physical boundaries, healthy boundaries.
And to add to that, I would agree, that's probably one of the most complicated parts of navigating relationships, whether you're a Christian or not, because even if you don't find yourself sitting in a seat where you have chosen to follow Jesus, I think it's still, when you choose to sacrifice on those physical intimacy pieces, it changes the way that you can move from relationship to relationship. The second part of that is, I would say that if you truly want to pursue something that not everybody has, which is a God-honoring and healthy relationship, you have to be willing to do things that other people aren't doing. And for me, that's choosing to wait till marriage to pursue somebody intimately in that way. And it's not always easy. It's not. And when you're through the thick of it and you're deep into relationships and you feel like you're going to marry that person, it's hard. It's hard to be willing to be honoring to them and to yourself and to God. But if you want to have that relationship be one that ultimately glorifies Him, you need to be willing to do the hard thing of waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's good. It's like, top that, right, Danelle? It's like, no, I'm out. What kind of pressure do you feel from friends, relatives, peers, even the church? And I should say, I was going to say that at the beginning. The advice that you would get in a service like this is kind of, you're not going to get that anywhere else in the culture today. So what we're saying, if you're new to church or just trying to figure this out, probably feels like, man, do you people live on Mars? And to some extent, we kind of do, but it generates a lot of pressure on Christians who are dating. And so where do you feel that pressure?
Oh, I will be the first one to answer this question. I will have to say that Christians are the worst when it comes to pressure. When you're dating, when you're single, it's always the pressure of like, when are you going to find someone? When are you going to get engaged? When are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids? It's always that pressure of what's going to happen next. And it doesn't ease up ever. There's no like satisfaction from anyone. It's always like, so you're dating now. Where's the ring? But
yeah, in Christian circles, but in the culture, I think it's very different.
Yeah.
I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, that pressure that you speak to is very real from other people. But for somebody like me, oftentimes the pressure that I experience from other people asking those questions actually puts more pressure on myself to be like, oh, well, maybe I need to be doing these things. Maybe I need to be pursuing this. When actually sometimes it means that I'm just in a space where I need to be intentional about pursuing God before I can be pursuing a person. But that's a really intimate thing to be working through and to be talking about. So sometimes when those questions come up as like small talk, they're actually not small talk. They're pretty personal questions.
Mm-hmm. Those can be very intimate questions when you're asking about that stuff. I actually think too that we can have a pressure on ourselves internally, the dialogue that we tell ourselves about being single. I used to tell myself life doesn't start until I'm married or I need a partner. And sometimes you can just tell yourself you're not worthy, you can't do something meaningful in the world without a partner, or your memories aren't worth it because you're not sharing them with somebody, or any of those things. A person doesn't complete you, and we can feel like it does. And those things that we tell ourselves are just lies.
What does it mean, because some of you were involved in like sort of the big idea for today, it's pick God, not the wrong person. What does that mean for you? When you think about it, what does it mean to pick God, not the wrong person?
For me, it means keeping God in his rightful place in my life, at the center of my life. And it's anything else that takes God's place in our life, we end up becoming a slave to. It controls us, it drives our decisions and emotions in really ugly ways. And when God is at the center, and he is leading our life, it's very different than if dating has become an idol. I can just as easily make my husband my idol or my kids my idol. The struggle doesn't end with dating once you become married. God needs to stay the center, and otherwise things just control you.
Yeah, I would also add to that, for me, it looks like actively and intentionally pursuing God first above pursuing another person. Because if I am not in a place where I can find myself intentionally pursuing a relationship with Jesus, then what happens is I start to slip towards putting the things that I need from God, the things that he designed me to need from him, onto another person. And when I start to do that, then that relationship starts to go sideways and starts to be unhealthy. And then the unhealthy parts of me start to come out in that relationship because I start to put unrealistic expectations on them, on myself, when I move God out of that primary spot of being pursued first before I can do that in relationship.
Yeah, one thing that I always remember, my mom used to tell me this all the time, practice at home before you go abroad. She was referring to cleaning, but I took it for my dating life, is that if I can't do something when I'm single, if I can't pray or read my Bible, create those disciplines when I'm single, it's going to be a lot harder when I'm dating, because I have to share that with someone else, keep not only myself accountable, but also the other person. So if I can't do that, then I'm not ready to take that step.
I want to thank all of you so much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Danelle. Thank you so much, Jen. Well, that was incredibly helpful for me, but I want to talk about what it means. Like, what does it actually mean to pick God, not to pick the wrong person. And I want to revisit a few themes that we talked about already in this series. So I think because, I've sat with so many people through their issues. Can I have a handheld? I think we'll just take that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, that's better. Is that good? Can we kill this? Thanks. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is we're just so worried that, like, I am not complete, I'm not ready, I haven't fulfilled, if you want to put spiritual language around it, God's purpose for my life, unless I actually have a partner, unless I'm actually connected with somebody, that I'm not actually complete. And that leads us to one of the themes that we talked about already, which is the fear of missing out, the fear of missing out. And so many of us, this is a huge thing. And I hope you didn't miss what they said about online dating. And I mean, that would be fun to drill down on sometime. But I mean, the biggest challenge that I have in talking to people in their 20s and their early 30s, when they're thinking about their life and their future, whether that's relationally or whether that's vocationally, what they're going to do with their life, where they're going to study, what kind of job they're going to have, what kind of career they're going to have, is they're like, there are so many choices. What if I make the wrong one? What if I pick the wrong person? What if I end up in the wrong career? What if I go to the wrong school? What if I live in the wrong city? What if I say yes to the wrong thing, no to the wrong thing? Like, how does that work out? And we just live afraid that somehow we're missing out, afraid that somehow God isn't going to provide for us if we make the wrong choice. Now, when it comes relationally, where does FOMO, fear of missing out, lead you? I think it will lead you into a number of different places. One thing, if you're like, you know what, and I think our cultural dialogue today is that sexual expression is the ultimate expression. That sexual identity is actually the ultimate identity. That's not actually true. If you want to know what your ultimate identity is that you have the fingerprint of God inside you. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, your identity doesn't come from your sexuality. Your identity doesn't come from your marital status, your relational status. Your identity comes from who you are. That God actually created you. God made you. God loves you. And even if you're not a Christian, you didn't create yourself. You're not some random person from, that just got created as an act or freak of nature. That God actually created you. But a lot of us say, no, my identity is only fully realized. My identity is only fully realized when I sexually express myself. And if you're worried, and we'll come back to this at the end of the message, if you're worried about missing out, I'll tell you where that fear is going to lead you. It's going to take you, especially guys, into very unhealthy places. Although this, in our culture, is becoming a universal issue, an all-skate. It'll lead you into porn. It'll lead you into a cheap, what you're really longing, what your heart is really longing for is intimacy. It's longing for connection. It's longing for relationship. And sex is actually an expression of intimacy, but on its own, it becomes a cheap substitute for intimacy. And a lot of people say it's just a biological act. Listen, and I don't think sexual sin is worse than other sin, but I think we can all admit that some of the most difficult sin to recover from, some of the most difficult issues to recover from, if you want to frame it that way, are sexual issues. I mean, you go bankrupt, a few years later, you can be back on your feet. You lose a business, a few years later, you get fired, you lose your job, you'll be back on your feet. You lose a friendship, eventually you get some new friends, et cetera, et cetera. But when you talk to people, when you're actually processing with people the deepest hurts in their life, it's not that sexual sin is worse than others. It is just very complicated and very difficult to recover from. And the scripture gives us insight into that. It says that's because a part of your soul went there. And it'll lead you into porn. And porn is such a cheap, twisted, perverted form of intimacy. So it'll lead you to porn. It'll lead you to hookups, to casual sex that says, I'm just either, friends with benefits. All I need is an outlet for my sexual needs. That's all I need. Are we okay with that? We're okay with that. Great. Not so great. I really believe, because Paul taught us about this, Jesus showed us, part of your soul goes, there's something different about sex where part of your soul is left with the person that you're sleeping with. So it'll lead you to hookups. It'll lead you to compromise. It'll take you a place where you say, you know what? I know I'm kind of in a place where I know what I should do, but I'm going to compromise. And moral compromise, I mean, the bad stories in people's lives, when you see somebody who's like, oh my goodness, that person's morally bankrupt, it doesn't start by one day they're fine, and the next day they go out and they just ruin their lives. It starts by compromising 2%, 5%, 10%, and soon 10 is 20, and 20 is 40, and 40 is 50, and the next thing you know, you're like, how on earth did I get here? And you know where else it can lead you, fear of missing out? It can lead you to settling. It's like you even knew this wasn't the right relationship. You even knew this wasn't the right person, but you're settling. And so what do? And again, the Christian position, the Christian understanding of where marriage and relationships and dating and all that goes, we are the minority opinion in the culture. Almost nobody believes this stuff anymore. But there is an alternate view, and I would suggest to you that the alternate view leads to life. And when everyone else saw FOMO, fear of missing out, you know what the Apostle Paul saw? He saw JOMO, the joy of missing out, which again, we looked at earlier in the series. He said, okay, everybody else is worried about what you're missing. I'm going to show you that this can be a great thing. And fortunately for us, the early Christians had some of the same questions about morality, about sex, about relationships, about marriage, about being single that we do. And Paul spoke into it, and they were trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a people of the resurrection? What does it mean that there actually is a God, that we're not anonymously created? What does it mean that God comes into our life and speaks to us? What does it mean ethically? What does it mean morally? What does it mean in all those things? So pardon me. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians, number of different verses. He's got a whole chapter on marriage and singleness and dating and all of those things. And I want to just look at a couple of verses. So he starts off with married people. And he says something really interesting. He says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations. So it's interesting. He says, if you're married, have sex. He says, if you're married, you should be intimate. Now, what's strange about our culture, like think about movies. The only sex you ever see on the screen is from people who are not married to each other. In fact, you've been so programmed that if you actually saw a married couple having sex on the screen, you would be like, ooh, it's so weird. And Paul's like, think about that, right? It's like your parents. You don't even want to think about that. You're like, oh, no. I don't know how that happened. It was an immaculate conception, okay? That's how that stuff happens. But he's saying, no, if you're married, have sex. Don't deprive each other. And do you know how many marriages are starved of intimacy? The very thing that we should be having in our marriage, and it's not just sex. But he's like, do you know, and I talk to married couples, and they're like, yeah, we haven't had sex in months. We haven't had sex in years. And he says, no. If you're married, have sex. Unless, there's one exception, you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. So here's the line. Honey, are you praying? Nope. Okay, great. All right, that's the line, just so you know. So try that tonight. Definitely try that. It's actually mutual, just so you know. And what he's saying is you should give yourself, if you're gonna so sex is the norm in marriage. And then he said, even if you abstain for a little bit, afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so you know what? Porn isn't a single guy issue, it's a married person issue. It's increasingly a female issue. And what you're dying for in your human relationship, you're trying to find in something else, and porn is a horrible substitute for intimacy. And yet so many times we kind of use sex as a weapon in our relationship. Paul says don't. But then he says something interesting. You're like, Carey, I thought this was a message on being single and dating and come on. You just jump back in a married world, which is the problem. But look at the context. This is so powerful. Then he says this, next verse. I say this as a concession, not as a command. It's like, what? He's like, I'm saying this because it's not actually my first choice. And then he goes on to say, you want to know what my first choice is? Look at this. I wish everyone were single just as I am. It's like, sorry? He says, I wish you were all single. It's like, now if that was true, none of us would be around. There'd be zero birth rate. That would be the end of things, right? The human history would have ended. But he's saying, I have a preference, and my preference is that you were single. Now, if you really want to dive into the context of Corinthians and to look at what was happening in Corinth at the time, things were tough. The resurrection of Jesus was fairly new. We are decades into the Christian faith. Everything's changing. But he's saying there's a preference. And then he shares his hand. He goes on. He says, each person has a special gift from God of one kind or another. And some of you, and this is something our culture would never teach. He says, some of you have the gift of singleness. Some of you, it's a calling. It's a calling to be single. And I know some of you are like, I don't want that calling. I don't want to be called that way, okay? Get out of my life. I don't want that calling. But he says, for some of you, it's a gift. So I say to those of you who aren't married and to widows, so you used to be married, you lost your spouse, it's better to stay unmarried just as I am. Now, this isn't a command from God. He's saying, I'm giving you my opinion. I think it's better. And he says, but if you have a high libido, if you can't control yourself, go ahead and marry. It's better to marry than to burn with lust. So Paul, very low, just go have sex, okay? That's what he's saying. He's like, if you can't control yourself. But then he goes on. You're like, well, that's kind of a weird concession. So what are you really saying? And then later on in the chapter, we're going to skip a few verses. He shows his hand. He says, you know why? I can tell you why. I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. And the word underneath that is anxiety. Pardon me. I want you to be free from anxiety. I want you to be free from all the concerns. And he says, what kind of anxiety? An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking about how to please him. He said, if you're single, it's exactly what we were talking about a few minutes ago. He said, if you're single, you have the rare opportunity to have focus in your life. You have a moment where you can come forward and say, you know what? Okay, for this season, whether this is a year, a decade, or forever, I can focus on God. And you know what the problem is? If we're really honest, most of us say, I don't really want to focus on God. I'm not that committed. I'm not that devoted. I will take a human being over God. I will pick a person over Jesus. And I'm not saying it is a calling for everybody. For a lot of you, it is a season. But in that season, this makes things possible. And he says, an unmarried person, you can focus. And you gotta know that. Was it easier to be a student when you were single than, say, when you're married? Yeah. Was it easier to have a date night before you had kids? Absolutely. But you've had kids. Pardon me. But then he goes on and he says this, but a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. And that's true. For a lot of us, it's like marriage is complicated. You have this, for those of you, if you're single, and I remember when I was single, you have this ideal view of marriage. And I didn't have a lot of fights. When I was single, I didn't fight with myself most days. It was like whatever I wanted to do, I just did it. And then I married somebody, and all of a sudden it's like, what, you have a different view? Are you kidding me? How does that happen? And he says, all of a sudden you have all these responsibilities, and now you got multiple mouths to feed, and you have kids, and kids have their own wills, and oh my goodness, and you're trying to please your wife, good luck with that. Your interests are divided. So the person who marries his fiance does well, but the person who doesn't marry does even better. And you know what we have? We have this view that singleness is just second prize. We have this view, especially in the church, that singleness is somehow some kind of curse. And our culture would say the same thing, man, if you can't express yourself sexually, if you're not doing that, if you can't express your identity is found in a person, your identity is found in your own expression. And you know what we would say? It's not true. You're loved. You're loved by God. You're loved by Christ. You're valuable. That your life has so much meaning and so much purpose, independent of what you do, independent of who you're with, independent of who you raise, independent of all of that, that you have value because God created you. And if you're single, you get to focus on that. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means a few things. This week, pick God. Like just for 7 days. Some of you are happily single, but for everybody else, you're mad at God. You're frustrated with God. God hasn't come through for you. Why is everybody else getting married? Why is everybody else dating? Why is everybody else having kids? Why is everybody else settling down? Why is everybody else able to find somebody? Why did my marriage blow up? Why am I still single after all these years? So instead of spending your mental real estate there, spend it here. Say, God, what does this mean? And as you do that, a few reminders that I hope will be helpful. And this is a point I got from some of the people we talked to when we put this week together. And they say, you got to talk about this, Carey. So number one, ditch the list. Ditch the list. Some of you, you've got a list of what that ideal person is like. And they said the great advice that they would have is ditch the list. You know, in your mind, this person is good looking, they're a certain height, you know, they have six packs, right? Not that kind of six pack, another kind of six pack. They have six packs, and you know, they're just really, really amazing people, and they make this much money, they have this kind of faith. The only thing that I would keep on the list, honestly, if you're a Christian, is make sure that that person's a Christian. Plain and simple. If you're a Christian, make sure that person's a Christian. And again, I've done ministry for a little while, so I'm going to tell you how that'll work. Because you're going to be tempted to settle. Because your fear of missing out is so great. And you're going to be, and there's this thing that happens, I see it happen in the church all the time. I call it flirt and convert. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to date this person, and this is particularly of women. All right, you're going to date a guy who's not really a Christian, but you're like, I know I can get him. I know I can get him. And you're hoping that, you know, he's going to come to church and all this. I got to tell you something about guys, okay? We do things when we're dating you that we have no intention of doing after we get married. All right, I used to go dancing with my wife when we were in Toronto. We'd go to clubs, we'd go dancing. I'm like, I'm doing the mating ritual thing. And then we got married, and I'm like, okay, no more dancing. And she's like, what? And I'm like, no, we're not dancing anymore. And she said, well, you danced when we were dating. And I'm like, no, that's exactly the point. And I won. So it's over. And now we go to weddings. Weddings are the most awkward thing. And anytime, you know, there's almost never not a dance. But when there's not a dance, I'm like, yes. Because every time there's a dance, she's like, so we're going to dance tonight? And I'm like, you know, I hate dancing. And so I'll try to do one or two slow dance things. And then everybody makes fun of me. My kids are like, Dad, you're more wooden on the dance floor than you are in real life, you know? I'm like, well, that's why I don't want to dance. So, you know, you got to, guys do that. And I'll tell you the truth. The only thing I would keep on that list is that that person is at the same spiritual place that you are. Because a lot of women are like, well, I'll tell you what, you know, he seems kind of interested right now, but I have sat with so many couples, and I'm not trying to be sexist. I'm just saying I've seen this. I've seen women get burned way more often than men on this one. And at the end of the day, they're like, well, he seemed really sincere until we got married. And then all of a sudden you have kids, and you're like, well, I want to take my kids to church. And he's like, nope. And then he says, okay, well, listen, you can take the kids to church, but I'm not engaged. The kids see that. And they'll come until they're 10 or 11, and then, well, Dad doesn't go to church, and then they're going to stop. And that's what happens over and over and over again. And some of the verses we didn't look at today, Paul is saying, if you're a Christian, marry a Christian. In fact, I don't do a whole lot of weddings, and there's a whole story behind that. But what I will do is I will gladly marry two non-Christians. It's like, oh, you guys are like, you're in the same place spiritually. I'll do that if I know them. I will marry two Christians. It's a bad idea to marry a Christian and a non-Christian. Because here's what happens in relationships. And you're going to say, no, these rules don't apply to me. What will happen in your relationship is that your relationship will gravitate, will drift toward the lowest level of spiritual commitment. You think, I'm going to raise my husband up. No, he's going to pull you down. Or he's going to break your heart. That's what's going to happen. So leave the only thing on the list Somebody who is your spiritual equal. Now, what if you're doing the flirt and convert and it's all awkward and now you have a terrible conversation at lunch on the way home? You're like, oh, I shouldn't have come this week, okay? What do you do with that? I would say make sure by the time you're engaged that he's leading you. Because maybe there was a genuine conversion. But if he's leading you, then it's probably going to stick. And if he's just coming along for the ride, remember, every wedding, when dancing comes, it's going to be awkward. I'm just telling you. So ditch the list. Second thing, ditch the demands you're placing on God. Pardon me. So you have some demands on God. And some of you, you're really angry with God. This goes back to last week because I was supposed to be married by now. I was supposed to be dating by now. We were supposed to have kids by now. Do you not know how old I am? Do you not know that my biological clock is ticking? Why do all the other people seem to get the people that I want? Why? So ditch the demands you're placing on God. You know what's happened? We'll talk about this in greater detail some other time. But as our culture has become more and more divorced from any kind of shared faith, let alone Christianity, we've taken all the expectations that we used to place on God and we place them on each other. And we say, this man is going to complete me. This woman of my dreams, are you kidding me? She is amazing. She's fantastic. You know, this guy, he is so fantastic. And then you realize after you get married, he leaves the toenail clippings around. And you're like, who is this guy? Who is this strange man that I married? And the reality is you're expecting, see, you married a human being. But because you don't love, because your relationship with God, our culture is really taking God out of the picture, all the things that we were created to worship are now on our spouse, on our kids, as Sarah said, okay? We're going to worship our kids. We'll talk about that next week in parenting. Mistake, mistake, mistake. Only God can provide that level of fulfillment and intimacy. And finally, a few things as we wrap up. Remember, you're like, well, great, this still leaves me alone. Exclusivity creates value. The most valuable things in the world are the things that are rare. Like, you know, there's only 3 bottles of this kind of wine left. There's only 3 of these 57 Chevys around anymore. Exclusivity creates value. And if you're exclusive and you're saving your soul for marriage, you're saving your body for marriage, if you're saving that and you're being a little more picky maybe than you want to be, it creates value. It doesn't diminish your value. And purity, as Andy Stanley has said, paves the way to intimacy. So as we close today, ask yourself, because this is a hard message. And again, nobody believes it. If you want a counter view, just turn on anything. Look at your phone. You will have opposite information in seconds. I promise you. Nobody believes this stuff, but I do. How can my life be better because I'm single? The Apostle Paul thought it could be. And you know, there's a question I learned from a leadership expert a few years ago who said, when things don't go your way, ask yourself, what does this make possible? So you're stuck in traffic and you're late. I find that very frustrating. Ask yourself, what does this make possible? Well, I guess I could make a few phone calls. Well, I guess I could pray a little bit more. I guess I could actually think about this problem I'm trying to solve. So instead of looking at what you don't have, what do you have? And instead of looking at what's not available, what is available? And then to get even a little more specific and granular, how can my devotion be stronger? How can I use this season, whether it's going to be a short one or whether it's going to be a long one, how can I use this season to grow closer to Christ? How can I use this to become stronger? And that's possible when you pick God, not the wrong person. Now, I know this is a lot easier said than done, and so what I want to do right now is I just want to pray for you. And we're going to sing one more song today at our locations, and I you know, if this is a hard time, I know that intellectually you're like, yep, but emotionally it's like, ugh. I'm just going to pray for you. I'm going to pray for you. And God knows. Father, I just want to pray for every person who heard this message and maybe doesn't agree, or maybe they agree, but it's just hard. It's a bitter pill to swallow. I want to pray for the women and men who just feel alone and abandoned. I want to pray for those who feel betrayed. Father, will you let them know that there is no circumstance that they're facing that you can't be in? That there is no level of disappointment and hurt that you can't heal? Father, I pray for those who want to make a turn, who are saying, you know, I haven't followed any of these principles we heard about today, but I think my life would be better if I did. And I pray that you would give them the courage just to make some decisions this week, to choose you, not the wrong person. And Father, I just pray that you would come into that space in our hearts that only you can occupy. And I pray this in Jesus' name.